So just a little bit about me. I'm obviously a practicing physician. I teach both medical students and public health students, and some of them are on combined track. I also direct a local public health department. So for each county or city you live in, there is a local health department that was very active during the time of pandemic, if you don't recall. And these were the folks who were giving COVID vaccine and making sure that the numbers don't go out of control and giving all the data to CDC and publishing the mortality and morbidity data. So that's the second hat I wear. I'm also a reviewer for any drug screening. So if somebody applies for a job, I don't know if you have worked anywhere in during your high school, during the summer, you give a little sample of your pee and that gets checked. So once the laboratory check it for substance and some medications, I'm the guy who sign on it to make sure that this is a legitimate use of the medication or not. So these are my roles. I do speak fluently and write Urdu. Okay, I can speak and understand Hindi, and I can read Arabic. So, and I'm into languages. So Spanish is on a very novice level, and I'm hoping to learn more of Arabic this fall and going forward. So, any question anybody has before we jump onto the presentation? I mean, I wish I was there in person, but hopefully next time. But I understand that you guys go through a lot of stages of examination and evaluation, and this is very good to know. The bright, all of you are very bright and interested in STEM careers, which is reassuring. We have a good pipeline. Any question for me?
Oh, they want to know what your favorite topic is.
My favorite topic, when mine was physiology and biochemistry, and that's when I developed my interest in medicine after taking a physiology course in high school in New York, where I did my high school. So yeah, human physiology for the most part, and all the processes that happen. I wanted to be a neurosurgeon, then I changed my mind because I fell into public health. In public health, you just don't focus on one person, but a community, and that's what we're gonna be talking in our presentation. So, I wanted to be an interactive session. As I said, it's more fun when we learn from each other and share some of the experiences. And I think, we don't have to go that far. You all had been a subject to experience COVID-19 pandemic, right? You may have had disruption of your schooling system and some family member or friends who got diagnosed with COVID, and you had to isolate and what have you, and some of you may have had the infection and things like that. So, it's really important to understand the implication and where we are, where we stand, right? So it makes sense. So let's go through some of the history. So what we would like to discuss is the impact of pathogens and toxins on public health. So, I mean, we are living in this environment, not isolated. So we have a lot of sort of interaction to deal with. When we talk about pandemic, you guys know the difference between epidemic and pandemic. So epidemic happens in local area. Pandemic is when it's worldwide or affect different geographic reasons. So just as people have spread across the world, right, from east to west, north to south, so did the infectious diseases along with them, right? So we are co-inhabitants. Some of the studies and archaeological findings do say that some of the fungus or bacteria are much, much older than human beings' existence, right? Millions of years. So they move around, population growth, right? They start urbanizing, destroying some of the other habitat, and then animal, we use it for them as a source of food, right? We use them for farming reasons. So they're a good source for many nutritious food. And then environment where we live in, as I said, when we build houses and take down all the trees, all these deforestation have its negative impact. So we need to make sure that we organize or develop some communities that are fully in line with some of the environment that we live in. So there is no change. But we know that a lot of cities are very, very thickly populated, right? China, India, and other regions in Africa. So, we have more people living in per capita region, so which kind of outstrip some of the natural resources, and then competition begins. Now, have you guys traveled outside of US?
Yes.
Some of you? Yeah? Like, name some countries.
India.
India, what else?
Britain.
Canada,
Mexico.
Canada, Mexico.
Jamaica.
I missed the last one.
Jamaica.
Okay. What did you find? What was a significant or stark difference from your hometown to a different country? What did you observe?
In India, the population density is a lot higher.
Uh-huh.
That's in Hyderabad.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else? Anyone else had noticed any significant differences?
It's really clean in Singapore.
Oh, Singapore. Yeah, it's one of the cleanest country in the world. I haven't been to Singapore, but yeah, that's what I've heard. One of my friend is a practicing cardiologist there, so hopefully I'll get to see him. How many hours of flight?
It was like 30 with a small layover.
Okay. Well, good.
20 hours of flying.
The point what I was trying to make was you saw different geography, how their communities are set up, their parks, school system, offices, industries and all the like. So, whether it's an island or in the middle of nowhere. So I've been to Middle East, I've been to Asia, Southeast Asia. So I see a different geography. So the point is that, we are determined by the environment that we live in, and that's how our practices change. So history of pandemics, it's a long, long history, but this is a very good slide that I found that depicts some of the major incidents. So, with the time as humans evolve, sort of the disease got spread out across the world as the trade became most of the focus, right? From one area, unexplored regions were explored, right? And people started living in. That's how America was found, right? So these are some of the deadly pandemics. So that happened from centuries and centuries ago. So what sort of things strike it? So these are the actual pictogram for these viruses. That's how they draw these viruses. So what do you see? You see that Antonine plague of Justinian were the earliest. And we'll talk about bubonic plague, which was the Black Death, very significant. And then smallpox, right? One of those series of great plagues, 17th century great plagues, and 18th century also. So what's happening? What do you see here that kind of attracts your focus? Are you aware of all these pandemics? Smallpox, plague?
yes or no?
Yeah.
Okay. So what do you think was the worst case scenario? Black Death? What about cholera? I mean, somebody mentioned they went to India, right? Southeast Asia or African place. They have quite a few. There's a lot of deaths due to cholera, which is quite common among young people, young kids, infants. We have seen yellow fever, okay? And then flu. It started with Spanish flu, the biggest one, and we will dive a little deeper into it. None of you were born by the time HIV was discovered. And then subsequently, in the last 10 years or 15 years, we have had swine flu, which is H1N1, SARS, MERS, Middle Eastern respiratory syncytial virus, and other. And it was the fact that they made, and then COVID, obviously, we know that this was the most recent pandemic. So the point is that these infections remain in the environment, but it doesn't become a big issue unless they cross borders, meaning if it becomes so significant, then we start thinking about it, or WHO declares as a pandemic, and so on and so forth. So why does it happen? Like, why cannot we contain these viruses or pathogens in their own location, right? So that's the question that we have to ask ourselves. And what could be, your generation would be able to determine some of the factors, hopefully to make sure that it doesn't go out of the control where so many people and millions of people die, and it still, it becomes a fight against this unseen pathogen. So I don't think I will be able to run this video, but it does show no. So it does show about the sizes or the comparison of these viruses. I found it very interesting. So look at these microscopic, we have some experts in your class who does a micro photography, right? Maybe they can chime in a little bit more. So you see these pictogram of these viruses. What is interesting? Anything?
Maybe three big.
Say it again.
The HIV one looks a lot bigger than the other viruses.
Yeah, exactly. And you see the cholera is right here, smaller one, right? And then SARS. So again, it's interesting to see how under the microscope they can look like, but COVID is right here, not too big, not too small, kind of in the middle.
When you're looking at like the severity of these epidemics, don't you have to consider like the relative size of the population at the time? Like some of these, like for example, like the Antonine Plague, right? It may not have killed as many people as like HIV/AIDS has, but it's like, there weren't nearly as many people alive during like the Roman times as there are now, like relatively.
Right. So that's a good point. Only 5 million people died. Well, I'm not saying 5 million, but there were more people as the population grew. So smallpox, 56 million. But look at the black bubonic death, 200 million people, right? That's a lot of people. So right, as the population density increased, so did the harmful impact of these pandemic. And this is what it shows. The very next slide, that how in 14th century, the plague that originated in rats and they spread it to human the infected fleas. They were taking the blood or feeding onto the infected rats and transmitted to, and you learn about the fleas, right? The tick bites and other fleas and other parasites that host on the blood from human beings. So this was one of the worst outbreak because it killed almost half of the Europe's population. And it took about 2 centuries for the continent to recover. And again, remember, this was spreading through the Silk Road and the trade routes back then in the 14th century. And then smallpox, we know that it killed almost 90% of Native Americans back in the 18th century. And almost 500,000 people were being killed by this virus. Spanish flu that happened, we know about the Spanish flu, the very significant pandemic before COVID-19 that we were comparing to, affected almost 50 million people. So this was pretty significant at that time. This is right around the First World War, and it just got out of control. And then the reason being crowded density of the people. Okay, and so Justinian was back in the 5th century, but only 30 to 50 million people were implicated compared to the other larger proportion of death caused by other pandemics. So how zoonotic diseases are transmitted? You learn about some of those from Andy's presentation or his interaction, right? How there's an imbalance, right, between these organisms. So this slide kind of depicts how these viruses or pathogen can transmit. So if there's a direct contact with human being, there's a bite, like we have seen from rabid dogs. What type of infection do we get from the dog that bite human being? Rabies, exactly. And some foodborne illnesses. If you consume raw milk, okay, and these milk that is coming from goat or cows and they're not pasteurized, what do we get? What type of bacteria? Salmonella. Well, it's usually E. coli, okay? Salmonella, E. coli, but you get the point. But they're normal floras that come. If you don't kill them appropriately, they can cause problem in human beings. And then the vectors transmission are like the fleas, the ticks, and others, how they change their mode of feeding from human to other four-legged animals or other cattle. and then they finally, or malaria, for example, right? You know how the malaria gets infected. We will cover that. And then airborne transfer of viruses can happen. We know bird flu that usually starts in flocks of chickens and hens, and then it kind of gets spread into the human being. So all in one, and we will look at individual routes of exposure in some other slides. A little bit of focus on Black Death. This is something that we still haven't solved the mystery, but we know that this was caused by the bacteria, Yersinia pestis. It was in the worst case scenario because of the population back in the 17th century. And that's when the social distancing and quarantine were used to prevent, because it was spreading very rapidly. And, you know, it was very difficult. In one of the books that I was reading in Europe, it said that there were so less people who were available to bury these bodies of people who died of Black Death. Okay, so there were only few people who could bury them. And there were like these massive cemeteries or graves that were needed to bury these infected people. Plague in human. So here we see how the ticks pretty much bite these rats, if these rats are being killed, and that's how the bug, you know, outbreak of epizootic infection gets transmitted to human being. And it's just like a very simplified version of a change in environment that leads to, for those, especially human beings who are not usually, you know, the source of feed for these ticks, because if they bite the dogs, they're less likely to get ill. But they can infect, you know, they can bring the fleas into the home, just like we have seen tick, deer tick attached to dog's fur or any other pets. They come to home and they bite human beings, and that's how the infection get transmitted. So right now it's a tick season, right? Andy must have reminded you. So what do we do when we go to wooded areas? How do we protect ourselves? Good. Right. And if we can avoid going into the woody area, we can do that, right? From dusk and dawn time, right? That would be the best prevention. Right. So just to recap, that this was the plague naturally occurs in Western United States, Arizona, California, Colorado, New Mexico. This bacteria is transmitted by fleas and naturally cycles among the wild rodents. Okay, and that's how it get affected. So touching, skinning these infected animals can cause, hopefully no one has this habit of skinning them, like rabbits and squirrels. I see squirrels all over, but the droplets from the cough of an infected person, it can also transmit from human to human through the droplets. So it's important that's why the quarantine and isolation came into place. I mentioned cholera, right? So especially in Africa and Asian countries where it's quite prevalent, and you know, infant mortality rate is pretty high because of this bacteria. Not all the source of water is very well chlorinated, therefore it leads to the spread of the infection. So when we travel to these areas, we need to make sure that you know, we are washing our hands, boiling the water, right? It's from the natural source, and avoiding anything that is contaminated with unknown source of water. So this was a third pandemic that happened in 19th century, late 1800s, which started in India, and that spread, especially in Europe and Russia. And a lot of children died because their immunity is not well established. So these kids are, and they can get really dehydrated very quickly because they have, you know, with their BMI and body index. So these kids can become significantly impacted with this diarrhea, illness. So cholera when it happened in 1853 in London, it claimed over 10,000 lives, and there were 23,000 deaths of all Great Britain. This is when scientist John Snow and others started looking at the vector related transmissions, if you remember in the history. So, and how to properly sanitize and clean. And there were some surgeons who were not using back in the days cleaned tools, but that really triggered some of the sanitary processes, which became standardized. Compare the cholera and plague, and tell me what other countries were impacted during that time frame. So distinguish between the cholera pandemic and plague, Black Death.
And I would say document your sources, so you know what links you went to, and make sure they are either an edu, a .org, or a .gov for source.
So what did you guys find? One person can summarize.
All right, so I guess one of the main ones is through the causes. The two bacteria are from different bacteria. Cholera is from Vibrio cholera, but bubonic plague from the or plague from the Yersinia pestis. Those are two different things right there. Then it's how it is transmitted. So it's like so cholera is more like a fecal or like hepatitis A and the different viruses. And then the bubonic plague is much more bite, it's bleed. That's how different bacteria that are sort of being there as well. And Jonah can do them.
Good. I'm glad that you learned the exercise. So that's what we decide the impact of the infection and sort of what mitigation strategies do we have and the like. So remember the Spanish flu, this first pandemic happened in Siberia and Kazakhstan that went to Moscow and Finland and Poland, where it moved to the rest of Europe. It was pretty significant, 1918 to 1920, but sort of the impact was several fold, affected 1/4 of a global population. So I think, the death toll of 50 million, it's really puts this pandemic at a very high caliber of human death toll, right? I don't think if you would remember the SARS. So this was during our med school time when we found out that this is the severe acute respiratory syndrome that is spreading to cats and then humans. Started in China and then followed in other 26 countries. So it was called pandemic around 2003. A lot of people were infected, and many had significant respiratory complaints. So let's shift gear or just briefly touch base on some of the vector-borne disease. I know you learned about mosquitoes and ticks that spread pathogen. Right now, it's a very high tick-borne season. We in public health department, we received the tick itself for those residents who have found themselves attached with tick. I don't know if you ever had seen they attach to exposed areas. Usually in this type of season, dusk and dawn is a time when we avoid, and they can transmit Lyme disease, right? So that's very important. And then malaria with mosquito bite. It's very prevalent in some parts of the world, like Nigeria. I usually have travel medicine with the student health when students go out to do their project in Asia or some part of Africa, they are given this prophylaxis. So, there are different types of pathogen or different types of strain, but we have, thankfully, medication that attacks these strain. So what is this malarial cycle looks like? Obviously, it's a parasite. It's tropical and subtropical prevalence in this part of the country. 290 million people get infected. Almost 400,000 people die of the disease globally. It has significant toll. So when mosquito becomes infected with this parasite, and when they bite human being, they obviously feed on, especially female Anopheles species, and they start transmitting this bug into the bloodstream. And what happened? It goes to the liver. Okay, infects the liver, then the liver cells start trying to mitigate or contain the infection or parasite, and then the cell gets burst open, and that's how it kind of gives you the chills, fever, headache, nausea, vomiting, and anemia. Okay, so there's a lot of complication afterwards if it's left untreated. So, but thankfully we do have effective medication. Some of them are getting resistant, but that's why a lot of research is needed in medicals and pharmaceutical where they can target specific species. Now, one interesting evolution factor. Have you guys heard of sickle cell disease? Anyone? Sickle cell anemia? So it's a trait that caused by a gene mutation in your red blood cells. Okay, those people, interestingly, who have sickle cell trait, they do not get impacted by the same malarial parasite. All right, so the evolution happened. It's amazing how, if you read the story, that those endemic areas where malaria is very, very, very prevalent, it used to kill people because we didn't have effective medication. So the mutation happened and their RBCs get sickled or like crescent shape, which is not very much favorable for the parasite to attach because they like nice and round red blood cells. And therefore, these people do not become full-blown, affected with malaria, and that's how they survive in those areas. It's fascinating. So when I started my residency training at UConn, we saw a lot of sick people, and this is people with sickle cell anemia and sickle cell trait. They would come up with different complications, but they're mostly, certain demographic with African American or some heritage in that area where malaria is prevalent, and they have other symptoms, but they don't get malaria. So again, these traits can have different implications. So I thought that it would be interesting for all of you to find out how evolution impacts changes in genetic composition for the survival of the humanity. Right, so we have covered quite a few of the parasite, but we'll still talk about some viruses later on, but I wanted to emphasize on blood-borne pathogen infections. So those viruses that get transmitted through blood or contaminated blood. So these are HIV, hepatitis B, and hepatitis C virus. So in healthcare, I'm sure you all have been through in different clinics as getting vaccines through pediatric clinic or any other exposure. So these healthcare workers, physicians, nurses, phlebotomists, they deal with a lot of blood from patients, and one can get stuck by these needles. So if they're drawing blood from an infected HIV patient and they injure themselves or they get stuck, there's quite a few likelihood of getting that infection, based on the infectivity or virulence of the virus. So let's talk about these viruses. So the most important one is hepatitis B virus. Okay, it's a DNA virus, as you can see. It impacts liver. The acute phase is fulminant, meaning it causes acute hepatitis failure, and people usually die if not treated immediately. It can become into chronic phase where cirrhosis or fibrotic liver disease happen and then becomes cancerous in liver cancer. But what do we know about hepatitis B? I think all of you are immune to Hep B because you all must have received hepatitis B vaccination, isn't it? Right? So when you, as a newborn, you must have received all these vaccinations to be protected against this very pathogenic virus. So we have different formulation of vaccines. Most likely you must have had Injurex B or GSK with 3 doses. 0, first, and 6 months, but there are other formulations. There's combined hepatitis A and B vaccine called Twinrix, but mostly this is one of the required vaccination for your schools. They won't admit you unless you have been vaccinated. I'm hoping that Texas has the same regulations. Let me know if it's not the same scenario as in Massachusetts, New York, and Connecticut. This is all mandated or required vaccines before a child get admitted. But know that this hepatitis B, thankfully, we do have a very effective vaccine that is protected against 95-99% of the infection. It's because Hep B is very, very strong or potent virus, more than HIV. Okay, it can live outside the body also for 7 days. So if there's a blood that was spilled from an infected patient, it can remain in the environment for 7 days, and it still can cause infection. So that's a important tidbit. Okay. So let's talk about hepatitis C. It's an RNA, single-stranded RNA virus. Unfortunately, we don't have any vaccine, but one is are you able to see my screen?
but
On the
it's not
color side.
updating.
Wait, screen. Oh, sorry. Why is the case? I don't know. Let me stop and redo it, okay?
Sure.
See, these technical difficulties. We are limited. All right, let's see. Let's see. How about now?
It's a different shot, yes. AIDS. Yeah. Okay, yes.
Okay, so just to look at the picture of sickle cell RBCs, all crescent shaped, okay, and nice rounded normal RBCs. That's what we're talking about. This is evolution. The bloodborne infectious disease that we look at, some needle stick injuries that happen among healthcare workers, or if you are working in a lab, be careful with the specimen that you're dealing with, because any instrument, whether it's needle or scalpel or anything, you need to make sure it's properly sterilized, right? Before you use it, you have all PPEs. Hepatitis B virus, B as in boy, we've discussed about it, how it impacts. It's a DNA, double-stranded virus, very pathogenic, virulent. However, we do have a very effective vaccine in these combinations, but you do require multiple doses, because then if you receive 3 doses, then you become fully immune. If you leave like 1 or 2 doses, it's not very effective against the Hep B infection, because very strong, very potent virus, more than HIV, and it can last outside of human body for almost a week. Okay, so that was a point. So this is the hepatitis C, which is a single-stranded RNA virus. We don't have any vaccine, but we have a very good effective treatment. However, hepatitis C is very common among those who had previously blood transfusion. Okay, this was not a screen back in the days, 60s, 70s. People would get into trauma or accidents and they receive blood transfusion. And lo and behold, later on in the life, they find out that they were infected with Hep C. But, you know, since 80s or late 80s, they've started screening all the blood because this is very indolent, meaning it can remain in the liver and not show any signs and symptoms, and ultimately can then slowly, you know, expand and the liver gets cirrhotic, or it gets fibrosed with all the scarring. HIV virus, we know about the epidemic of HIV, right? How it impacted certain demographic back in the 80s when this was discovered. When I started my residency training, we had seen a lot of HIV patients with different complications. But in the last 10 years or so, about a decade, you know, we have come up with very effective treatment, antivirals that, you know, targets this infection. And now HIV has become a chronic disease, meaning people, just like with diabetes, high blood pressure, now they take their HIV medications and carry on with their normal day-to-day activities. Who is the basketball player who was, you know, who declared that he was HIV positive?
Magic Johnson.
Yeah, so you guys know that. So, you know, what happened was, if these celebrities had these infections and they were treated successfully, this became sort of, you know, a good marketing tool for clinicians and other to say, look, you know, you can be treated if you report and you are checked. So first of all, we need to make sure that we check them if they are HIV positive or not, and there's effective treatment. So exactly. So they're living normal life because it's now classified as a chronic disease, no longer a pandemic. Okay, again, an RNA virus. My understanding is that some of the vaccines are in trials to see how effective it would be. We don't know for full, you know, just full scope of activity with these vaccines, how effective they are, because the clinical trials are underway. TB. Okay, so we often forget about TB. It's still quite prevalent, and a lot of areas are infected. So it's like a very slow, indolent infection. So the bacteria resides in your lung tissue and slowly it changes. You can see or appreciate in this graphic how these small cavity becomes larger and coalesce, and this you know, becomes fibrosed or scarred. So what happens if the lungs are like spongy tissue? They cannot exchange oxygen, which is required for all your body cells to receive. And you know, the infected person start losing weight, they have cough, they are just overall very sick, and they transmit in their cough. That's the problem. It can be easily transmitted. Millions and millions of people are infected. If their immunity goes down, then this bacteria, raise their ugly head and infect all the organs of the system, unfortunately. So detection becomes a key for this infection. With pandemic, when we were focusing on pandemic so much, we forgot or put this in the rear end, and a lot of folks became actively infected with TB. So states like Connecticut and others have this TB control program, and I'll share with you in next few slides. We have a list of reportable disease, TB being the one. They monitor the number of cases, and this is specifically show how many cases we had per 100,000 in Connecticut in last 3 years. So it's about 2.5 cases in the United States all over the country. However, in Connecticut is 1.9, so roughly 2 per 100,000 people. So if you think about it, in the states you live in, on average, 2 or 3 people may have TB that are, roaming around. So what do we have to do? We need to come up with a robust surveillance program. Okay, we need to educate our public health departments. We need to educate our patient population and their families that if someone was born in endemic region, oftentimes you may remember, I'm pretty sure before you start your college, they will check your immune titers, they would get you vaccinated, they probably will check you for TB also by doing a blood test. They have some fancy blood testing now. It used to be skin testing, but now they do a blood test called IGRA, or interferon gamma release assay, that checks if your cells had been exposed to the TB pathogen or antigen. Okay, but this is important because it has some public health significance. It gets spread very easily in crowded areas. So again, those places where the human density is very, very high and crowded, it's a very strong likelihood of spreading this disease. Okay, in Connecticut, most recently, we found that this was quite prevalent in Asian population, Black, Hispanic, and then white. More than almost 86% were not born in US. They were immigrants, and then 9% were born in US. It doesn't mean anything but to the fact that some other countries do not have a very strong screening program. In industrialized countries like the US, they have implemented some strict policies, and that's the only thing. If we don't have any screening, we would not know how many people are carrying this bug. Now, the other issue is that, TB can impact other organs. So it's just not just lung, but it can also impact other organ. Skeletal bones, skeletal system, okay, can be impacted. And some of the risk factors are any reason when the immunity goes down. So diabetes, for example, can impact your immunity. Okay, for the patients that we see. So substance abuse, anytime we have someone abusing any type of symptoms, they have reduced immunity, and the TB pathogen can get reactivated. Okay, we have people we screen for latent TB infection. So what does latent TB mean? Is meaning that they have been exposed to the bug, okay, but they haven't become strong enough to show any cavitary lesion in their lungs. All right, if they live close to someone who have had TB, they work in the area where TB was prevalent, or they lived, or they're from. So all these factors play a role, and we screen them for any latent TB. Okay. Now, the problem that we have noticed in last several years is the multi-drug resistant TB. So the TB treatment used to be 9 months. Now it's been curtailed to 6 months with more advances, more stronger medication. It's a great public health case study when we deal with TB progression and TB infection in any community for that matter. So the drug-resistant TB is because a person was not taking all the drugs in a timely manner, or the medication, right? Did not go through the proper course and treatment. And now the TB bug is resistant to those traditional medication, okay? We have multi-drug resistant, we have extreme drug resistance. So there are a lot of strains of this bug that is very resistant to medication and requires some intensive treatment and sometimes hospitalization. Okay. So very important to be screened. And I think, we have those factors into our healthcare system. So if one of you were to volunteer at any hospital setting, you will definitely be screened for that, because I know it's part of the policy. I make those policies for my hospital, for my system. I'm sure others do the same, because we really don't want you to be infected or spread the infection, vice versa, from the patient and or from any other staff members, right? So that's why I wanted to emphasize that don't forget TB. I know we have been very, very busy with pandemic and we lost our attention, but this is still an ongoing problem. Any question on TB? Do you know of anyone in the family or relative, distant friend who had been diagnosed with TB?
Yeah, I do.
Okay. What was their outcome? Were they treated successfully?
I don't remember the treatment, but I remember I went to India sometime when I was like really young.
Uh-huh.
And the person it was like my aunt, and she got tuberculosis in her spine actually. Yeah, I never it wasn't like got TB, but it was like I had like exposure and stuff. So I went through like that public healthcare process and stuff with like they tested and everything there. So like I got to talk to the epidemiologist about like how they all do it.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. Yeah, this is very, very important that we educate people and right, India and Asia and even in China, we have had some residents who immigrated from China, had latent TB. So the point is not any specific due to ethnic background, but because of the living situation, if they live closely, TB is everywhere. It's all across the world. So we need to come up with screening program, and that's why it's important to have these, give everyone they have to be vaccinated. So therefore, if they ever work in a healthcare setting, do not get lethal infection. We have effective way of screening for TB, right? So all these factors do play into role in a larger capacity, and it would have impact, because if one person gets infected, if they have extra pulmonary TB, that's even more invasive and difficult to control. Good. I'm glad that some of you had an exposure. So cholera, I mentioned earlier, again, very basic strategies: washing hands, making sure the source of food is proper in the areas where you cannot get any filtered water. Boiling is one of the most commonly used methodology. Bottled water should be used in areas. So when I travel, I make sure, especially in Southeast Asia, I make sure that I'm always drinking mineral water or bottled water. I don't take a risk because and don't eat any dairy products, right? They carry all the different bacteria, and when you start living in different environment, your microbiome also get adapted. Okay, so very important. Right, so let's shift our focus on vaccines. I mean, we have to give credit for many of the vaccines that came into being to prevent these pandemic. I mean, we know about COVID-19. We all have lived through it. It became a hot political issue, but we know, that the only way to curb some of the ongoing or spiraling effects of this pandemic in human death toll was through effective prevention and treatment, right? So the treatment part was just symptomatic treatment, but vaccines really played a role. And I was reading an abstract in New England Journal of Medicine, which shows that millions of people survived or their lives were saved because of effective vaccine. And by far, compared to other countries, US did the innovation part. All the vaccines were developed here. They became the most effective, although we heard other countries trying to manufacture the vaccine, but they were not as effective as those that were made here. And I think the reason is because of the, with the technology and all the careful analysis and clinical trials that get done. So, full marks to the scientists who were involved in the discovery. But we have to classify these vaccines against what type of pathogen they're targeting. Is it live attenuated vaccine? Is it inactive vaccine? DNA? So for example, live attenuated vaccines are like MMR vaccine or yellow fever. Okay, I don't want to go into the specifics, but think of that they are they're weakened, they're attenuated, and do not cause the actual disease, but they or provoke immune response, so the antibodies can be formed and memory cells are formed. So our immune system is fascinating. I mean, I think it's one of my really interested area when I was into medicine, how it functions. We're still learning more about it, but the B cells, T cells, and how it really shapes the fight against these pathogens, right? The inactivated vaccines are like polio vaccine, pertussis vaccine. They are completely killed. So they're not live, therefore they have no potential to infect someone. So someone may think, oh, I'm going to get this infection because I took the vaccine and the vaccine had poliovirus. No, that's wrong, because this was completely inactivated. The DNA vaccine is, it's in process. Ebola vaccine was conducted to the DNA plasmids. This would code for those specific immune response in memory T cells and B cell. Now B cells form your antibodies. If you don't remember, RNA vaccines are commonly used. We know about mRNA vaccine for Moderna and Pfizer. Now this is cheaper, easily produced, and then it's pretty much very much into research. A lot of other cancers are being looked into to be tackled with mRNA vaccine, because I think the technology is clearly expandable, and hopefully one of you guys will make those vaccines to combat cancer. There are subunit vaccines, for example, hepatitis B vaccine that we find very much effective, 95 to 96% against the virus, safe to be used and given. And then we have replicated viral vector vaccine, non-replicating virus. So there are different examples, but I just wanted to give you sort of an overview of how these vaccines are manufactured, and they are clinically, used in practice. It's still evolving, and some of my friends who work with pharmaceutical or they're into bioinformatics, they're really, with AI, with the help of AI, targeting specific genes, and I think we will see much more innovation in that realm. And I think if you were to get the vaccine, that would require maybe 1 or 2 series, right? And not to take daily medication, especially for malignancy, cancer drugs, it will be a game changer. I think there are a lot of clinical trial. The issue is that these clinical trials take a long time, right? Because of all the regulations and checklists, and some of them do fail even after taking all those precautions, meaning that they don't find any difference between the population with the placebo and so on and so forth. So they have to keep modifying and keep going to find it, effective. But what I tell my patients or family members, like, we know enough about those vaccines that are already here or available that are effective. We have seen, against smallpox being eradicated, polio almost, but there are some countries that still they're struggling to eradicate. But so there have been successful, steps and policy globally that has impacted. Again, another slide to show different type of vaccines that are available. They are either intramuscular or intradermal, but most of these vaccines are intramuscular. Polio is interesting, in very high pandemic area like Southeast Asia, they do oral polio drops, not intramuscular, but in America and Canada and other industrialized world, they give intramuscular because of the nature of the strain. Okay, so one vaccine can be a little bit different in region based on the and if any one of you know that someone who was born in India or some other, or in Europe or Africa, they were given BCG vaccine, because this is something that they give all the children. TB is very prevalent there, and if they don't give vaccine, they may die of TB. But here we don't give any BCG vaccine.
Actually, I have a question. You said we don't give BCG vaccine in the United States, or I know my family relatives in India all got the BCG vaccine, etc. I also wanted to know that at least in my experience with people I've interacted with, and what I know is that the testing also for tuberculosis is really only on an as-needed basis. So why? So I get it. So why is it that we don't get the BCG vaccine, even if it's low prevalence in our population? Like, is there like a sort of negative impact of taking the BCG vaccine, or is it a question of like distribution of the vaccines to like other areas in the world?
So the most important reason why we don't give BCG vaccine is not because the TB is not as prevalent, and BCG vaccine is only effective when you have a certain threshold for the number of cases or active TB disease, right? Since we as a country here have effective screening program, they have not considered BCG to become preventive vaccine here, right? So it's based on the prevalence of the condition, and then the living situation is not as crowded with the density as we talked about it. So think of it as as an organization. So in the US and other industrialized world, the population is not as heavily in terms of density region versus other parts of the world, and then sanitary condition are as such, and the systems are placed where you get a screen for that, right? It's not that TB is only geographically limited, it's just the TB infection causing the one. If and when a person has active TB, he or she is more likely to spread it out in the community versus someone who is carrying a latent infection. So based on the cost of cost and effectiveness of a program, so screening upfront has or pay more dividend, has more positive impact than to give everyone a BCG vaccine. However, BCG vaccine is being used by urologists in some of the tumors because it has other effective methods to combat some of the cancer cells, especially urological or bladder cancer. This is what I've heard from my urology colleagues. But for pulmonary TB, I think in the US, because the threshold is low of getting active TB, it's not included in those vaccination schedule. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that answers my question. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. All right. So in this slide, I mean, if you look at it, it just talks about some of the viral related issues and how we have come to understand the way these viruses are transmitted, the region that get affected, right? Not to say that we still have West Nile cases, but the number of cases or the incidence has gone down. We still see Marburg virus or H1N1 we have the vaccine, the flu vaccine that we received, that strain is included in the vaccine, right? This was when I was in my residency training in 2009. Then from the Middle East, we heard about the MERS infection that was originated in Saudi Arabia through camels, because the camels population is there, right? In desert, that's the only mode of ride there. Okay, then Zika virus, we still see Zika originated in South America, especially Brazil. Lassa virus in Nigeria, and COVID, which is sort of, again, from how it transmitted to Europe, and from Europe it came to America, and then just globally spread. So the point is that it's very difficult to isolate or put a boundary around any country through geography, and because of the world trade and also the human travel path that anyone can travel across the globe in 24 hours, right, so to speak. So the infection can spread rapidly as well. We have to come about, and WHO does a reasonably okay job, but I think because of some of the political aspect to it, the countries who give more donation, and that's how much of that interaction goes along. But each individual country is required, or they need to have a robust public health policy in terms of combating epidemic that may result in pandemic. So I don't have any control over a different country, right? I don't practice medicine or public health in others, so the rules and regulations may be different. So if we follow some ethical, guidelines to make sure that this does not get out of control, then we have a better luck. Because once it's out of the box, so to speak, then it's very difficult to contain it. That's what we saw in COVID-19, right? So these are the species or genus, different type of viruses, and the reservoir. You can see this yellow fever, dengue fever, mosquitoes. I can tell you that this is an active season for us in public health. There's some sites in our state, in Connecticut, and I'm sure there are other in other states, they have a catchment area. They trap these mosquito trap sites. I'm sure Andy may have shown you this or talked about it. They get checked in the lab to make sure that they're not containing these viruses, these mosquitoes and ticks or fleas. They get usually surveilled in these state labs to make sure that they're not carrying. So that's how we detect, right? But not to say that it could be anywhere, but we need to have these checkpoints in place, so to speak, because we know the complications of these infections spilling to human being. Okay. Now, emerging infectious disease, or I would say re-emerging. Who do we need to blame for? Well, we are the most advanced or intelligent species on this planet Earth. So we got to take some blame. For selfish reasons, we have caused some harm, so to speak, and the only way to admit that is to ensure that we take our responsibility and come up with other strategies that help in curtailing these infections. So to give you an example for antibiotic resistance, we have seen multiple times, and there have been advisories not to prescribe antibiotic for viral illnesses, but it still gets prescribed. Antibiotics are ineffective, completely useless in any type of viral disease or illnesses. But for it's a placebo effect that they do, and this is what I get in tough conversation with some of other family members to say that, well, it's a flu, it's a viral illness, it's going to get better on its own, so no antibiotic will be effective. So illegal wildlife and exotic pet trade is causing a lot of issues because of all the transmission. We know that animals being fed some pesticide driven feed, that gets impact. So at multiple levels, the change in climate is happening, where if we don't do anything, it's going to be more problematic for your generation to face land misuse, some of the burial practices. They embalm human bodies that doesn't get decomposed fully. We remember what happened with the wet market in China, how the virus got spilled over, and still theories are there. So all these human related factors, unsafe sexual practices, we have rising case of STI, and some of the strain of gonorrhea and chlamydia are becoming resistant to antibiotic, right? So some industries dumping those chemicals into water system that gets back into our usable water or aquifer, and then some of those who use well water, they don't even know that they're being contaminated with some of the other chemicals because it doesn't change the taste or doesn't change the color of water, but it's just there. So all these activities may have an direct impact on emerging infectious disease. Okay, and then it causes more problem unless we have a better resource dedicated towards these detection and prevention. So as I mentioned, that antibiotic resistance is very, very alarming, because we have seen folks either not taking their medications on time or over prescribing of these antibiotics, not having prevention, early prevention, for example, avoiding some risky activities, slow in terms of detecting these infections, poor hygiene and sanitation practices, and unnecessary usage of antibiotics in agriculture because of those cattle animals or farms. If they treat them with pesticides, sprayed grains and other feed, it's going to have impact because we eat them. And not to say that even vegetables, even plant protein source, or whether animal protein, but animal more than plant protein, but we are a product of our environment, right? So we need to look at these factors. And I think you can appreciate when you are given all this knowledge to see what's around you. So your creative mind should be thinking about how to mitigate these factors. How do we educate, other folks around us? They may or may not know all these factors, but it's incumbent upon all of us, you going into the college or talking to your colleagues, looking at bad practices, trying to prevent that early intervention. So what are some solutions for these antibiotic resistance that we have seen? I mean, according to CDC, I think if we can detect those resistance early on, by improving the testing mechanism, this will really help us curb those spreading infections, because once the mutation kicks in, it can sort of go into perpetual mode and become really significant, to cause a lot of sickness in not just in animal source, but also human beings who are consuming. I mean, if you remember, oftentimes we get salmonella outbreak, right, through salads and or other meat, right? So we see that this is just a orophycal contamination happening at the processing industry or some other steps before the food gets to us. All these factors do play a role. So if a worker is not protecting themselves or are ill and is still cutting the meat or processing these meat or other edible items, it's going to impact us at the source. Right. So those, and how do we improve the prescription medication usage is by educating each other. So do you expect your doctor or your nurse practitioner to prescribe you antibiotic all the time? I mean, those who are non-medical people should be aware that sometimes it's best to run the course, not take cough syrup for cough, because it's just going to suppress and cause more problem than solution. So all these factors, they're not the best topic at the dinner table, but one must realize that these are they have consequences, right? The food chain, right? It all impacts at every stages if we ignore them. How many of you have been prescribed antibiotics in the past? Every one of it, yeah. And I can tell you some of them may have not been necessary, but it's still, right? Ear infection and other swimmer's ear, very common viral infection, sore throat, right? It's just one after the other. But those, seems pretty easy and harmless, but they have long-term effects. So One Health is a concept, or at least a way of approaching this issue, and that is sort of the idea that the health of the people is connected to both the environment and the animals that surround us, not just only the animals that we eat, but the pets and other, the food, the chain that sort of, other animals that are interconnected. So it's important to see, so we cannot just focus our research on human being, but we also have to see these species and how this disease get transmitted and, what happens through that course of action. So if we protect one, we will help protect all of them, right? Because they all are living beings, and they have, we cannot just ignore all these non-human factors, so to speak. So, your action matters. So does the policies that are made, and how to preserve the different chains at different, because at the end of the day, where I would say this, where the buck stops, right? We are the most intelligent creature for the most part, right? We don't know who lives outside of the earth, but at the moment we take the blame or the responsibility. Right. So I promised you I'm going to show you, this is a long list of reportable disease, emergency illness, and health conditions. So every state that you belong to, they should have something similar to this. So it's a detailed list, category 1 disease, category 2 disease. Anytime the lab detects a sample of these conditions, they have to report to the state, okay? Anytime a physician or a clinic detect these conditions, they have to report. Now you see there are telephone icon next to some of the disease like HIV or anthrax, botulism. That means if you detect or the lab find these positive cases, they have to pick up the phone and call emergency line to document this course or record this this disease, okay, immediately within 24 hours, or actually 12 hours that they have now make it mandated, right? So tuberculosis is also one of those. Measles, okay, meningococcal disease, any type of foodborne outbreak, which means more than 2 people were involved. Plague, okay, we still see pneumococcal illnesses, polio, rabies, right? We have had some rabies cases. If a rabid dog had been a human being, we need to send the sample and immediately inform the DPH, Department of Public Health. So all this is important to document and report in a timely manner, and so they can track it and curtail it before it gets out of control. Any question? Now, I think this this data get reported or rolled up to the CDC database. So I'm pretty sure that all the states that you belong to have a robust. I know Massachusetts has a very comprehensive system, and their public health department is very active in surveilling, especially the occupational health and the bloodborne pathogen. I know some of the folks who are very, very active in doing that, but I'm sure all of you who belong to different states have similar list, if not the exact reportable cases. Any question? Any comment? Do you think it's important to have these type of reportable disease so the state can invest some of the funds and an office area and hire some people to pick up the phone and continue to monitor? Do you think it's a good investment?
I think it's a good investment. I had a question actually. So I know you mentioned back in COVID-19 pandemic, there's actually like a rise in TB cases because people weren't taking it as seriously, or like in a rear view. So I wanted to ask, like, similarly, with COVID-19, with the different emergency response systems, how much of a big issue, like how much of like work, I guess, did they get during COVID? Or like how prevalent was like their response that they were getting, or how many people were calling in comparison to COVID back then?
I can tell you my experience. It was a difficult time, but it was mostly reported through electronic and through other sources. So you mean phone, they were not calling us directly because it was not required. Is that what you're asking, if they were calling us directly?
Calling directly, and also for like other diseases too. Like, did we see like calls for those other diseases going down?
Yeah, not much. Yeah, we did notice that the calls were going down because of, again, this what happened. It also delayed some of the routine screening among pediatric populations. So you're right. Pandemic really slowed down the surveillance process all in all. So one common example I remind everybody is like TB. We stopped screening people for TB. Okay, and then if you think that you have stopped this very contagious disease for a year, what's going to happen? What's going to happen in a year? They will be full blown, right? They will be more, they will be more lethal, if anything, right? So you're right. So meaning that, yes, it slowed down some of the processes in place, unfortunately, but time of it was a tough time, and we may have lost some people because of the delayed screening and treatment. Does that answer?
Yeah, that answers my question. Thank you.
Good, very good. Good question. So let's talk about toxin. Are you all familiar with lead? Yeah. In what ways? Paint? Okay, good. Now, can anyone tell me what was the most significant public health intervention that happened in the US that decreased the lead level in the atmosphere?
Unleaded gasoline.
Exactly. Unleaded gasoline. You're right. It wasn't the paint, so to speak, but the gasoline portion, taking lead out of it was. Now, I've been told, again, I don't know, some of the older mechanics were saying that having a lead in the gasoline made car like running like anything, we don't know. We never experienced that, right? Not that we should, but back in the days, having lead as a gasoline component prevented all the knocking and smooth transmissions and what have you. It was a nice drive back then. But thankfully, it's been removed, and the environment has really picked up, and they did the air sampling, and it's really have come down. But the paint has also played quite a bit of role. But right now, what's happening, if you were to find a child, a toddler, 5-year-old, not living in a Victorian house, which is with the lead paint, but their blood lead level is elevated, what are you going to suspect as a detective? What do you think is coming or causing contamination? Source of contamination. Think about it.
Water pipes.
Correct. Plumbing. That's good. Excellent. Sometimes medical students don't know these answers. You guys are really good. You've read the history. Anyone from Michigan? Ian?
Ian.
Yeah. So Ian, remember all that thing. So, how a pediatrician was smart enough to detect this problem, and these plumbing, all these pipes that are lead-based, again, it's a very good metal, but it's leaching into the water system, and that's how these young minds and brains are impacted, and it can cause speech and language problem, not to ignore anemia, high blood pressure, kidney disease, digestive, so you name it. It's a very significant toxin, okay, as problematic as any bacteria or virus, because it impacts many organ systems. You can't ignore that. So yeah, lead containing products through food or water and ingestion became the likely source, because we had removed lead from the atmosphere in the method of de-leading our petroleum. Okay, but this is again a problem, especially in Northeast New England region, where the first colonies and other areas were established, and those pipings are still very old. So there's an ongoing process of removing those or replacing those. Another important thing is asbestos. You guys know about asbestos? Good. So mercury is still, naturally occurring metal. It's very toxic when it's released in the environment. I remember seeing some of the sphygmomanometer, blood pressure devices having mercury column going up and down. Pretty cool, but in some non-industrialized countries, they still use it. Okay, in some light bulbs, they had mercury, tungsten wire, mercury thermometers, and then silver dental fillings also had mercury. It's a very important element. We get advisory from our Department of Public Health when we have fish or shellfish when they get checked with a high mercury level. So it goes to local public health department as an advisory not to eat those fish species or samples, or not to do fishing in that particular area, river, pond, or what have you. So it's still a problem because it's very toxic, and it can go through and impact fetus, growing babies. So it's very important to protect the mother, pregnant women, and especially in other parts of the world, having those, believe it or not, I've seen some of the cosmetic products being mixed with mercury. So it's important that we are aware of that, and these lead and mercury being used in those cosmetic products that are brought in the US. There was a case report I remember reading a couple of years ago, and it was due to some of the product that was imported. Okay, didn't go through the FDA evaluation. Do you guys know what pesticides? It's commonly sprayed in many parts. It's just amazing how much of that is now. Different states have strict rules. So if someone is applying this pesticides, they have to go through the licensing and training and education before they get the license to apply for pesticides. And some pesticides are more harmful than the other. Some cannot be degraded and they stay in the environment, unfortunately, but it gets seeped through the aquifer, and then we are exposed, right? The plant or the fruits that we grow in can have the residual of these pesticides, some of the crops, right? That's why we look at the labels if it's organic, meaning that they did not use pesticides. So when you go to the grocery store, what fruit you think has the highest residual pesticide if they're not organic? So the answer is berries. Yeah, so I've stopped eating inorganic berries because they contain the highest level of residual pesticide. Again, I don't get any any sidekick from any berry growing farms. I love berries, so they're very effective antitoxin. I mean, so are other fruits, but yeah, it's just because of the size maybe or the crop that they use for. So in any event, I mean, you see that the land profile, how it changes, the water movement, and what these pesticides remaining in the environment can impact our health negatively, because we do eat all these fruits and vegetables, right? So if those farmers are not being careful and are not using green products or less toxic products, unfortunately, it has a cascading event. And some of the other countries that have lax rules and regulations, it becomes problematic. Any questions so far before we talk about opioids? And the reason why I want to talk about it is because, as I mentioned earlier, one of my certification is as a medical review officer, and I see all these urine drug testing. So, and when you go out in the job, you will all be given the samples of most likely saliva, and I'll go about it. But before that, we covered infection, pandemic, different types of infection, viruses, how we combat these viruses by having effective vaccinations and antibiotics, but then the side effects of resistance, how we avoid that by improving education and hygiene practices, right? The concept of One Health. Any question, any comments on that? Did you learn something new?
Yeah, I did. Actually, I just had a random question that popped in mind about the antibiotics. So I know started a bit ago, you talked about it. I wanted to ask, so we talked about antibiotics are important for controlling disease, like these bacterial infections. So I wanted to ask about there's certain individuals who are allergic to a lot of these different antibiotics. And so I was wondering what sort of process with those people, or a lot of people have a penicillin allergy. So how do they should get treated for these?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. So those who have penicillin allergies, right? So we do have other non-penicillin antibiotics that can be effective against this pathogen. So when, say for example, one patient came to our hospital and is infected, right? So we send blood sample, okay? We draw the blood, we send it to lab, and they grow those blood into the culture, and that's how we find a specific bug that is growing. Is it a bacteria? Is it a fungus? So once we grow them, that's how we find. And quite amazingly, the lab also does the sensitivity testing. Okay, so there's a culture and the sensitivity. So they have those. Think of it as an experimental place. They grow this bug or the blood sample into specific plates, and they find which antibiotic they are resistant against, or effective antibiotic that can kill that germs growing further. And that's how the lab reports to us that this person whose blood sample had E. coli is sensitive to penicillin or cephalosporins. There are different classes of antibiotics, not just penicillin. There's many different type of antibiotics. But amazingly, when they do the testing, we know exactly what antibiotics to treat them for, because they've already grown in lab and shown that their effectivity against specific antibiotic is far superior than the other one. So they measure the response also. One is very strongly recommended, and the others go down the list. So if, say for example, if one person is allergic to one of those antibiotics, there are always other options to go. Does that clarify?
Yep, that clarifies. Thank you.
Okay, good. No, those are good questions, because sometimes we go there, give our blood for the blood testing. We don't know how the doctors or the clinicians have decided to pick one antibiotic versus the other. Right. So opioids, right? So this is I think in modern day that's the pandemic or epidemic we're dealing with. There are a lot of opioid related deaths, unfortunate, in all age groups. No one is immune to this. And I think for your generation, it's important to recognize, and you may find some of your peers or some of, you go to college or other areas, you may find someone having the sign of addiction, having sign of opioid abuse. And I want all of you to put your detective hat and try to help them, because there's a lot of resources we can save if the intervention is effective. So it's a public health problem, obviously. There's a lot of resources and education, but I think it takes one of us individually to make sure that we detect this problem in our community, in our circle of friends, or anyone we find. So don't be shy to confront these people and provide them help. You're actually not becoming their enemy by confronting them, but actually trying to help them, because this is just a vicious cycle. And we have seen a lot of young people, right, being inflicted with this unfortunate event. So mental health, substance abuse, if you've noticed someone, you all are very talented people out there, but make sure that human life matters. And we are here collectively, and the toll that may come from different angles. We talked about, different reasons, but this is something that has been abused or misused. Anything that used in excess or for no good reason results in abuse and harmful effects, right? So think of that. So I want to make sure that you are aware there are many resources available at every stage, especially in this part of the world. Don't be shy about seeking out and letting your the person who is inflicted with this problem, and they can seek help in a timely manner, because time is a key. The longer, unfortunately, we delay, the more problem we can anticipate. So with this, I will make sure that you keep your eyes as an investigator, as a detective, and be aware of the surroundings. And if you find these problems, because this is the ongoing epidemic that we're facing in this country, it didn't stop actually during pandemic. It actually got worse based on the numbers. So this is really concerning. And because of the fact that it's so widespread and does not pick immunocompromised or a specific socioeconomic demographic, it's prevalent across the board and age group. So please, I think, be the partner, be successful in what you do, but be aware of where you practice, who you interact. Your words will become effective if you try to do the good for the community, for not just for one person, but also for the community. So whatever you do, always remember that you're part of the same chain. My actions will impact you, and the like would be your actions will be impacting others. So we cannot be isolated. We're all part of the same breed, so to speak, right? So just think of this as a linked chain, and at any given point of time, we can make an impact. So I will conclude here. Thank you for all your attention. And Kathy, back to you.
Thank you very much.